Welcome to the Crazy Wisdom Podcast. My guest today is John Lee. He is an early stage investor in deep tech, focusing on companies across frontier, enterprise software, cybersecurity, AI/ML, and automation. So welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Stuart.
Yeah. So how would you explain what deep tech is?
Yeah, I guess there are kind of like two ways to build companies in San Francisco or in Silicon Valley or startups in general. I think one form is you kind of assemble existing technologies and you build a product really quickly, and you kind of expect to get traction on it quite immediately. And a lot of your value is based on the traction that you develop. Deep tech, on the other hand, the capital structure is somewhat more akin to something like biotech, where you have a much longer incubation period. And the theory behind that is that you can develop technologies that give you pretty substantial advantages to be able to accrue value much more significantly in the downstream. And so I kind of categorize everything that requires a long bake-off time as sort of deep tech. There are a lot of intricacies within those two things where I think there's a lot of innovation to be had, but I would say most classically that's kind of the description or practical reality of what a deep tech company is.
And from my understanding, essentially, we have been in sort of a wasteland for deep tech in the last 20 years. It seems like there's been just software, software innovation is the only innovation that has existed since at least 2006, maybe even earlier. Is that an accurate statement? Like what from you, have there been, as you as an individual consumer, not necessarily an investor, have there been any sort of major innovations in the technology world that have really, really affected your life outside of software?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point because, I would say that in some ways, like from a funding perspective, we've actually, I would say, been generally in a pretty substantial renaissance in deep tech over the last 10, 15 years. But in terms of like the real lives of consumers, I would say there has been that much penetration of deep tech. I think that we're just starting to see people use autonomous cars for taxis in San Francisco. That is kind of that was a big effort around deep tech going back the last 10 years. We're starting to see lots of robots in warehouses. And so in some ways, like I would say, like there's been a lot of infrastructure built out and a lot of technologies innovated in the last 15 years. We're probably just starting to see the deployment of things into real life. Whether that continues or doesn't continue, I'm not quite sure what will happen, because I think a lot of the deep tech renaissance over the last 15 years was driven by extremely low interest rate environment where capital could be deployed in these projects with a lot more ambition. That has effectively evaporated in the last 2 years. And so I'm not quite sure what will happen going forward from this point on.
That's really interesting, because usually I come at the interest rate perspective from a book I read, which is a great book called The Price of Time by Chancellor, and an excellent book that goes into kind of the negative effects of low interest rates. But what you just said is kind of puts an interesting spin on that, which is that there was a whole bunch of money, cheap money available that just got dried up, that may have been sort of really substantial for trying to make really crazy bets. And so do you think that that's accurate, that a lot of that money was actually put to good use, and that it started what we might be seeing now is sort of actually benefited from those low interest rates?
Yeah. I think that there were types of companies that were funded that probably would not get funded in a more capital strict environment. I would say a lot of those probably have not ended up as good investments and probably aren't great investments, but for society at large, they're probably highly beneficial. For the investors of those companies, I don't think those are great investments. And so, I think a lot of the autonomous driving companies have turned out to be not so great investments. Not many have really exited with very high IRR. I think companies like SpaceX, though, are companies that probably would be somewhat difficult to start today and get funded. especially if you're not an entrepreneur like Elon. You know, a lot of those space companies, they're still seeing some funding, but I think the need to generate revenue in the near term is just much greater, and the onus to generate revenue in the near term is much greater. I do think, though, that there are kind of interesting hybrid models, and in some ways, scarcity drives innovation, where honestly around deep tech there hasn't been that much business model innovation. Like in some ways, it's almost like crazy simplistic and crazy crazy immature, where like everyone just assumes once you develop a technology you'll be able to sell it, but there's like very little creativity around how to go about selling, how to actually build businesses around deep tech. And you know, that translation piece is actually something that I've been really focused on kind of in my career. I started my career as more of a classical deep tech investor, starting at Lux Capital, and then helping build a firm called Osage University Partners that take technologies directly out of scientific and academic research labs. And you know, my issue in this time was a lot of the go-to-market models were just so uncreative, and they weren't actually businesses. And so, you know, in some ways, I actually think with the scarcity capital, it actually forces much more creative business models, which I think is probably better for the space longer term, because eventually you need investors to be able to make money for there to be continued investment in the space. And I don't know if that's really happened to date.
It's so interesting. So many different ways we could go. Scarcity is a really interesting concept, particularly for business model innovation. Have you seen any kind of interesting new business models out of this now period of scarcity that we're in terms of, you know, like interesting ways to apply these new technologies? And I guess that's an intro into like, can you share some of the interesting technologies you may have seen, if you can speak publicly about them?
Yeah, definitely. You know, there are probably like two examples in our portfolio that I really love. And maybe I'll start with one that's much more on the deep science, deep tech space. You know, there's a company of ours called Rarebase, and they target finding cures for rare disease. And there's a lot of systemic issues why it doesn't make sense for traditional pharma to invest in drug development in rare disease, just because the population sizes are so small. But if you count up all the people that have rare diseases, in aggregate, it's a massive population. It's over 10% of the US population that has some form of rare disease or another, and they don't have cures, which is kind of mind-boggling. And so what Rarebase does is they are very much a deep tech company in that their platform for finding drugs is pretty experimental, pretty out there. But what they'll do is they'll characterize certain cell types, sometimes taking patient cells. They'll create stem cells out of them. So they'll make them pluripotent, and then they'll force them to turn into the cell of interest. So if it's a brain-based rare disease, they'll turn it into neurons. And then they'll use CRISPR to knock out all the genes to figure out precisely where your rare disease comes from, and then target that site with only drugs that have clinical data on them. So either drugs that have been approved by the FDA, so there's about 7,000 drugs that have been approved by the FDA, they'll use those, or they'll use drugs that have failed in the clinic but have interesting and already available toxicology data, toxicity data, or some efficacy data on it, and see what drugs work. And so what they end up getting is they get drugs that have tons of data on them, many of which seem to actually work for a lot of these diseases. And since they're single point mutation diseases, you understand the mechanism of action of these diseases really well, so that you can be quite certain that if you see positive data on it, the data is actually quite clear. That business model is actually to sell or license out those IP assets when they're mature stage. They never intend to be a clinical drug development company, but it's a true platform where they can generate revenue. They're actually close to cash flow positive as a company. And it's a really novel business idea, this idea of how do you build a platform biotech company that's extremely cash efficient, but has the upside of a normal biotech company. And so, you know, that's one I'm really proud of, because it's really hard technology, but they're doing it in such a way that is highly cash efficient and actually finds cures for people that don't have them. And, you know, the beauty of the business there is actually the business model creativity. It's something that is quite unique. The second example of a company that we consider a deep tech company is one of our portfolio. This is still sort of stealth, but it's a portfolio company of ours called Count. And the whole idea behind Count is, can we make accounting firms much more efficient? And the way that we're doing that is we've recruited and we've brought in as co-founders some amazing machine learning scientists, AI scientists, and we go and acquire existing and running accounting firms. And what we do is we use things like large language models, lots of AI techniques, existing off-the-shelf tools, and we build dozens of widgets every single quarter, and we throw them against a wall to see which ones actually have a real impact on the gross unit economics of an accounting firm, and see which ones can actually drive margin improvement, operating efficiency. And this is real deep technology. This is technology that is really difficult to build. Sometimes people are training their own foundational models, but we're effectively running an AI research lab within an existing operating company. And, we're kind of pushing the boundaries of what's possible in terms of unit economics and margins in accounting business. Once we have that solved, we're going to go and roll up lots of other accounting businesses and scale this thing. And so, that's an example of like building a deep tech company in flight while generating economics, while building a business, and experimenting with a go-to-market and business model in an extremely risk mitigated way. And I think that's really the important thing is companies to this point have not needed to risk mitigate because capital has been so freely available. Now you need to be able to risk mitigate with actual cash flow, revenue, and traction.
So interesting. I want to go back to that. Let me see if I can find the name. The rare base, and you said that they're characterizing cells. They're taking the stem cells and then they're forcing them into whatever part of the brain or whatever part of the body that disease rests in, and then they're testing to see if these new drugs work. Is that like all in vitro, or like is it all in the lab, or is it, or well, I probably just answered my question there, because it's like if they were actually to take out testing, then they would become have to go through the FDA in order to start those tests, basically, right?
Yeah, they take this all out and they'll do it in dish. What's interesting about it is, they've actually, in their scans, not only have they run FDA approved drugs, they've also run like over-the-counter compounds. So like plants, things like, like cough medicine, or, just random things that in like even like supplements. And like for a handful of disorders, they've actually found that like over-the-counter medicine is extremely efficient and seems to work for these things. And once they collect a little bit more data, they intend to publish these things and make these things open source. And so, the beauty of that model is it truly is open science. It's the idea is to find cures. There's no way we can commercialize something that doesn't have patents and it's freely available. And so why not make those things available for free? The company can effectively find cures simultaneously for close to 4,000 rare diseases at the same time, which is amazing. And so, there are rare diseases that they'll be able to find cures for that they're not even thinking about. Just happenstance, they'll find something.
Very cool. That's very interesting. And so this seems to set the stage for a question we were talking about earlier before we started to record, which is how important is geography right now, either as an investor or as a founder? How much of it is centered in San Francisco, particularly in relationship to this deep tech renaissance that we've been discussing? Is that centered in San Francisco, or is it a worldwide phenomenon?
It's definitely not a worldwide phenomenon. And, there's something so special about the United States that allows us to be much more risk-taking and forward around innovations around deep technology. There are probably significant clusters to it. The historical clusters have certainly been San Francisco and Boston. I would say that San Francisco remains an epicenter of a lot of this stuff, because it really does matter being able to have people around you that can really be somewhat collective intelligence, to, where you can brainstorm and talk about things. It's kind of funny, like in some ways, like I see these large language models and foundational models as collections of human intelligence, because they're largely trained on internet content that humans have created. And so it's really just like the statistical system of finding human concepts that are near each other and producing them. And that's kind of the aha, very interesting creative moment that comes out of it. In some ways, you know, that human network is present in a much more specialized and skillful setting in San Francisco, where you have lots of really amazing people in deep tech in really interesting fields, like everything from people that are working on new molecules or drugs to people that are working on interesting things around climate change or fusion or AI machine learning, which is broadly applicable to almost every single deep science out there. And so, you know, it's still a space where you get a confluence of people that you just don't find in a lot of other cities across America. And so, you know, it's still very special.
So this very interesting kind of subject we're on right now, which is we've got these machine learning algorithms that essentially take concepts and relate how close they are to them on a spectrum, and say like a cat is closer to a dog than it is to a human, and kind of a very oversimplification of what they're doing. But you know, they're taking these concepts and creating kind of intelligence, artificial intelligence based on purely linguistic reasoning and such. And then we've also been talking about how essentially inside of San Francisco, inside of these clusters, you have people in exact geographic localities that essentially allow for some sort of mind meld to happen. And so the idea is that basically there's been this huge push towards remote work, which I've taken advantage of. I love it. I'm a huge proponent, but I do recognize that also being in that same physical location, there's something special that happens. And to me, that's something special that happens. It's almost useless to talk about it in terms of words, because like there's something there that may not be able to be represented by words in terms of what happens when you get people into those same physical locations. What do you think? Is that can we actually precisely nail down what exactly happens when you're right next to somebody and what that mind meld looks like?
Yeah, you know, it's funny, like just keeping the analogy of with these large language models, you know, I kind of, or and actually neuroscience as well, you know, I consider emergent properties, right? So like when you have these large language models, the most beautiful thing about them is that they seem to have skills that emerge as the networks get larger that nobody could have predicted prior. That's because a lot of crosstalk between these different nodes seems to create capabilities and skills that weren't intentfully designed for. And in some ways, like that's exactly how the human brain works as well. We have emergent properties from different functions in our brain that come out that like form these like skills and abilities that we could not have thought for. You know, for example, like our ability to anthropomorphize animals is like a really interesting crosstalk between the social part of our brain and like the biological data part of our brain of like, you know, what the world means, cross-talking to say, you know, you should treat these animals almost like humans and befriend them, and then they'll help you hunt. And in the same way, like in San Francisco, like you have, like, I consider the emergent properties are like effectively innovations. It's like, you know, someone from, say, like the neuroscience world talking to a philosopher that specialized like in Heidegger, talking to like a machine learning person, and then people thinking, oh my God, like a fantastic way to view like AI alignment is like reactivity and like social truth, like based on Heidegger, like, you know, things like that. Like those are innovations that come from crosstalk between different kind of skill sets or intelligent beings.
And it goes back to what you were saying about business model innovation as well, because you got deep tech, but that business model is a cross-disciplinary thing of like, okay, well, we've got this technology, we've got, you know, like we've got the image of the nerd working in the basement, kind of building this thing. And then once they build it, immediately money, profit, step two, profit. But in reality, it turns out you need to actually put another step in there, which is to innovate on the actual business model that is opened up by this sort of thing. And so what I'm getting from this conversation is that San Francisco, the real key to San Francisco's success from 1990s until present has been its ability to do cross-disciplinary kind of emergent sharing between minds that might not have kind of, but how much of that is the culture of San Francisco? How much of that is the universities that surround the how much of it is like Stanford, the fact that like the way that Stanford was as a university is kind of different than its other elite universities in Stanford? What's your take on that?
It's all of it, right? It's like the Bay Area still is a major destination for extremely intelligent people, and it's also the home for industries that are pretty diverse. It's the home for lots of finance, like lots of private equity and venture capital firms. It's the home for, obviously all the tech firms out here. It's the home for lots of biopharma, pharma, and just like a ton of different industries that kind of force people that are at the top of their game all to converge on the city. And, there's also a cultural element to San Francisco, which is very different than the East Coast, where, there's kind of a libertarian tint to the city, so a bit more anti-regulation or avoidance of regulation. The city is more open and progressive in its thoughts. I think the psychedelics revolution starting in San Francisco has had a major impact on the way that people think and their views about the world. And there's also less hierarchy here, and much more of a meritocracy. And so, I think all those things are, come together to bring lots of really interesting people together from lots of different spaces, and that's what you really need. You need diversity in talent and accomplishments to be able to generate diversity and innovations in lots of other fields. That company Rarebase, the founders had very different backgrounds. One came from being a chief scientific officer of large pharma, pioneering functional genomic expression models. Another was a former architect / tech entrepreneur on the consumer side. Another, had run services clinical businesses on the CRO side. And so, those three people normally would never come under the same roof, but they came together very focused on solving a problem around rare disease where incentives weren't aligned before. And I think like that kind of thing, it's very difficult to try to recreate that in, say, for like, I don't know, like South Dakota or something like that.
Yeah. Well, okay, there's a couple different questions. There's one just like a personal interest. How did those three people meet? Like, is there some sort of chance occurrence, or did they work together previously? How did they actually, do you know how the origin story of how they all met?
Yeah, I'm not actually quite sure how they all met, but one of the founders, he himself had a rare disease, and he helped find his own cure using kind of AI techniques, and he found that a breast cancer drug worked for his brain tumor, and that was kind of the initial idea. And then they found that there are a lot of academic clinics where individual physicians are repurposing drugs on a one-off basis with patients, and they seem to find cures a lot of times, because in reality, drugs cure symptoms. They don't cure often root causes. And so, oftentimes symptoms are shared across lots of different indications and diseases. And so it would make sense that, like if you're curing symptoms, you could probably cure the symptoms of lots of diseases out there.
Okay, very interesting. There was another question that we could have gone down, but I've now unfortunately forgot what that is. But we do have this question of AI and emergent capabilities and specialization. My assumption is that specialization, as we know it, which has been such a foundational kind of, like the whole system we have set up right now is people go to college, specialize in something. Once they specialize in something, they go further into that specialty, and it just keeps on going further and further and further. And that's also within an academia of you study this highly niche thing, so that you can kind of create this thing that's your own, and you create a PhD on it, and you defend your thesis, and it's highly specific. And do you think that that's going to go away with AI, and that these specializations are essentially like on their kind of, unless it's super impactful, and maybe outside the realm of what AI can do? Do you think the generalist is now going to have their time in the sun?
That's an interesting point. like in some ways, like I actually think that these AI models that are really popular today, like large language models and like ChatGPT and GPT-4, they actually elucidate the challenges and shortcomings of being generalist only. And like, you know, in some ways, like I think like our society and culture, at least at the elite level, have become victim to kind of keeping their options open for too long, and have had somewhat arrested development on you know, pushing off specialization. You know, there are hordes of extremely intelligent and capable people that go into investment banking or consulting, which, you know, are not specialties. They certainly teach you a lot of skills, but a lot of those people are not kind of deep in something, learning how to build a true skill, because I feel like a lot of people don't want to put all their eggs in one basket, which is fair. I do think like their apprentice model and being able to specialize early is actually pretty helpful. And, you know, the only analogy I have for that is, you know, in Silicon Valley, we see a lot of companies that get started and they say they're a platform almost on day one. And I just find that so odd because, you know, you're basically a master of none and really not good at anything, but you call yourself a platform. You know, reality, a platform is something that's good at a lot of different things. And so in some ways, people are premature in calling themselves a platform. The only times I've seen platforms actually develop are when companies and startups focus on doing something very small, really, really well. And then they get to a scale and financial strength and sustainability that they can then expand their product offerings to become a platform. But even then, they need to be able to execute on a lot of new businesses in order for them to actually become a platform. And I kind of see that the same as people as well. Like, you know, you get this like kind of weird phenomenon where you have people that are a year out of undergrad that are consultants that think that they have the capacity and experience to advise very large companies or advise any companies. And I find that bizarre because they really don't have any experience whatsoever.
They're just smart.
And so they're just smart. Yeah. It's in some ways, it's the exact same thing for GPT-4. It's very smart in its ability to like pull facts and things from lots of different domains. But if you specialize it to actually get work done, it becomes really stupid really quickly. And then you start to realize that it just doesn't work all that well for a lot of things. It's great at pulling kind of loose threads together and having really fuzzy answers, but it's not that great at actually accomplishing anything.
So that's really interesting because that changes my question now from, I think you're right, that the more you bring in ChatGPT into a specific specialty, the more it kind of loses its value, particularly when it doesn't have access to all of the problem set that you're working on. You know, one of the main problems right now is we've got a company, you know, I work at Invisible and we got this whole knowledge base, and it's impossible to get that context inside something like ChatGPT at the current moment to then have it give me good answers. And so that's part of the thing about missing a specialty is it can't absorb all the context. So me as the specialist on Invisible have to narrow down my specific context and then get it inside of the ChatGPT in order to get it. And so the question is now becoming, when do you think that AI will eventually get to specialty level competence, and how far away do you think we are?
I do think it will, but I think we're quite far away. And I think the architecture of the current models, I don't know if we can quite get there. You know, if you think about it, you know, there's this weird example of Xerox copy machines, where, like, you know, when you use a Xerox copy machine, you assume it's going to be completely accurate, a perfect facsimile. But there's a bunch of documented cases where Xerox copy machines mess up some numbers. It'll replace 6s with 8s or something like that. And the reason that happens is Xerox, how the copy machine works is it takes a photo of what needs to copy. It creates a digital format for that photo, and then it reprints that. But, you know, when it changes, you know, from like a CMOS lens sensor to like a digital file, it does lossy compression because it's the only way that you can convert into a digital image. And in that lossy compression, you lose a lot of information, and then when you reproduce it, you reproduce lost information. In some ways, there's a New Yorker article on this. They call GPT a lossy compression or JPEG of the internet, which is exactly what it is. It's just all this information that has been compressed into a CSV or into a model, and then all the weights are in a CSV and then reproduced every single time. And so however sophisticated and however amount of data there is, there's always going to be some form of loss and compression to be able to regurgitate it in interesting ways. And so, because it's statistically based and there's no world knowledge in that, I have some doubts whether the current architecture will actually get you to highly specialized information within an AGI system. But let's put that aside, because that's more of a philosophical discussion, more technical discussion, and there's lots of people that can opine on that are way more qualified than I am. On the current models and their ability to scale, I also have some concerns on whether we'll be able to get there. OpenAI has publicly said, they want to get to a place where they, I think, have 100 trillion parameters, and that they think that's the tipping point to get to AGI. The reality is the amount of data that you need for 100 trillion parameters are hundreds and hundreds of petabytes of data, or thousands of petabytes of data. Common Crawl is something like 20 petabytes of data or something like that, and we've effectively exhausted that for GPT-4. And then outside of that, data becomes a lot lower quality. And so the amount of data that you need probably expands pretty substantially. And so no one really knows how much data we'll need and how it scales. The simple fact is we've kind of run out of extremely high quality data, and we have much lower quality data. And so regardless of if you have the capital to pay for the compute and the training, I don't know if there's enough high quality data out there to be able to get these large language models to a place where AGI actually exists. And so, there's been a lot of discussion in the startup ecosystem of whether all these AGI talks are really just ways that large FANG companies and OpenAI can scare regulators into giving them regulatory capture. I think that's probably more likely what's going on than actually people at OpenAI thinking that AGI is going to happen soon. I don't know. That would be my tinfoil hat theory, because I think the math is pretty simple on how much data is available, and I just don't believe that they're aware of that as well.
So there's a few questions there. Very interesting. I like the way you put it. I would also put on my tinfoil hat there, and have been putting that tinfoil hat on. And I think it's actually probably accurate, because anytime you have fear involved, there's often a large marketing component to that fear. But so data. Have you been following the synthetic data that they've been training things on? I think Llama is using synthetic data, so data that the AI itself is producing, or something that I don't understand, basically, about them actually training it on data that is being generated. Have you heard of that?
Yeah.
Do you think that's a way to get over what you just said?
Yeah, that seems like a horrible idea to me. Because you're effectively using another form of classifier to create data for another classifier. And so I just don't understand how, rather than ameliorating problems and errors, you actually just don't compound them. And I think there have been a few early papers in the space that have showed dramatic degradations in performance training off of synthetic data. It's I get concerned about that, and I get why some of these foundation model companies are trying that, because I think everyone sees the writing on the wall on the amount of data available, and also the incremental increase in costs and human labor involved in creating and labeling. They just see it as kind of enormous, and so I don't know. I mean, I'm looking forward to seeing more progress on that. Hopefully it works out, but I doubt it. I mean, it just seems like a really terrible idea.
And this is specifically around linguistic data that is Reddit, Quora, Google, all these different things that the LLM is absorbing. And that's one kind of data that we humans really focus on. But then let's maybe, and this might go back into that philosophical technical angle, but these sort of multimodal, like how can we use like visual data to train LLMs? Like, does that even make sense? Like
Yeah.
we use those models that have been developed for cruise to then the self-driving cars to also improve these models, or is that totally outside of the realm of the possibility?
Yeah, I personally think the multimodal models that are going to come out in the next month or two are going to be game changers. They're going to reignite a lot of interest. You know, a lot of people are saying that the foundational model boom is somewhat dying down, but I think once people see some of the capabilities of these models, it's going to be mind blowing. It's going to be crazy, and the reason is, you know, multimodal data is a lot richer, and you know, you start, one of the emerging properties seems to be execution, and so a lot of the companies that we're focused on analysis, like you're going to be able to actually execute things on your desktop. It's going to be able to book a flight for you. You know, I've had some conversations with people working on these, and it sounds like, you know, some of them have short and long-term memory, and the way that it parses and figures out what to embed into long-term memory, it actually has a period in which it will consolidate information in short-term memory, embed it into long-term memory, and it will be down for a period of time. And so the emergent property there would be sleep, which is kind of crazy. And so, you know, I'm very excited about them. You know, like there are some demos from one of Google's first multimodal models that, you know, it could help book a flight for you and suck in your preferences in order to do that. And that stuff is going to be crazy cool. And I'm very excited. It's going to have a lot of the issues that we have currently with large language models. It's going to mess up a lot. There's going to be a lot of mistakes. But I actually think like all the stuff that popped up around just language models, there's going to be a lot of interesting stuff that pops around these multimodal models, maybe even more, maybe even things that are a lot more capable. And so I'm pretty stoked for them. Like after multimodal models, I don't really know where it goes from there, because I do think we run into a similar kind of data bottleneck problem, but there's probably a little bit more room to run there, which I'm pretty excited about. It's going to require a lot of labeling though, and labeling is going to be challenging.
Interesting. So we might already be at that long tail where the 20% in the Pareto principle, where we've already done 80%, and that next 20% is going to require a huge amount of labor kind of thing.
We could be. I could be wrong though.
Yeah,
I hope.
Yeah. As we all can be. So okay. So going back to deep tech and connecting this to deep tech, do you see that these LLMs or other models being really helpful for the innovation within deep tech? Like, are any deep tech companies that you're familiar with using machine learning in order to improve their ability to do their business?
Oh yeah, we have an incredible amount of companies that are using transformer models. You know, I think one area that isn't all that obvious to the public are companies that are using this in computational drug discovery, and it's had a massive impact on companies' abilities to be able to figure out, generate new compounds that fit into targets, to understand targets better, and hopefully be able to dramatically improve the results as well of the drugs that they create. You know, we have one portfolio company called Avita Biosciences, and you know, they use these transformers and large language models in a lot of different areas. They're looking to find active compounds within plant medicines, and you know, one thing they use large language models for is, you know, they analyze 10,000 years of ancient texts to find every instance that humans somehow use a plant as a therapeutic. And you know, they came out with a bunch of target plants to go after, and then they use transformers on mass spec to be able to identify the very specific bioactive compounds they think are having therapeutic effect. Like, those things wouldn't be possible without these foundational models or these transformers. And you know, that's having a real impact in sciences where, you know, honestly, science up until this point has largely been artisanal. You know, it's been benchtop. It's been like, you know, it's been much more of an art. And you know, we're turning it into somewhat of an engineering discipline, which is super exciting. It's super exciting. And so like, I do think it has the potential to accelerate lots of science. I think like a lot of people's assumptions are science is what generates technology, but I actually think it's the other way around. Technology is what generates good science, and having these tools available is going to create a lot of breakthroughs. We've had really substantial declining productivity in science over the last 3 decades, and I think AI machine learning is actually driving a really interesting renaissance across lots of different disciplines in those fields, because it applies to everything from social sciences, like just understanding how like human behavior is and human psychology. You could apply it to nutrition. You could apply it really to any field in science, which is really exciting.
That's very cool. I have just a personal question. In terms of those plant medicines, have you heard of anything in terms of isolating what are the main effects from iboga or ibogaine? Have you heard of either of those plant medicines?
Yeah, ibogaine. They haven't. I don't think Invita has done any work on ibogaine specifically, but there is kind of one company that is just getting started that is going to do some work in ibogaine, and that's a really interesting psychoactive compound, which has like a very different it seems mechanism of action than like psilocybin and LSD and some of those things.
Yeah, it's
very interesting. I'm not an expert in that, so I don't know a ton, but I hear there's some really interesting work going on there.
Yeah, if you hear of anybody, please send them my way, because I'm fascinated by that substance in particular, and how it just like it seems like a magical drug for interrupting the withdrawal cycle for this really, really gnarly withdrawal from heroin. So it's a very, very fascinating one. Artisanal science. I really love that term, turning artisanal science into engineered science or something along that lines. So let's go to deep tech. I found out about people putting solar panels in space and beaming down the energy. We've got drug discovery. We've got kind of applying machine learning inside of accounting. Any kind of broad buckets for what deep tech is really the kind of the themes that you're seeing for new deep tech companies, like energy, anything like broad bucket categorization of what's going on inside of deep tech?
Yeah, I mean, I would say there's been a number of material science and energy funds that have popped up that have, some impact or philanthropic back to them, but they're quite large pools of capital. And so they've been funding a lot of interesting stuff in energy generation or material science. I think that stuff is fascinating. I mean, I think the stuff in fusion is really interesting. You could argue whether it really makes sense for us to be pursuing fusion, whether it's actually a much better source of energy than fission. But I think the research into it is wonderful. I think the two spaces that really are exciting for me are one around epigenetic reprogramming, which is the ability to effectively change the way that our transcriptome produces proteins, where it could have pretty dramatic impacts on everything from our longevity to lots of different indications. We're just scratching the surface on what's possible there, and that stuff will have a pretty meaningful impact on humanity. The other area that I think is really interesting is innovations around reproduction. I think we need to figure out a better model for IVF. We need to figure out a better model for how we have children. For example, there are some efforts on how do you create egg cells from like a blood cell, which I think is really interesting. And so like if that were the case, you would render the egg freezing industry. You wouldn't need that anymore. Like you could just create egg cells from scratch. Additionally, like there's a lot of research going on in like artificial wombs, which I think is really interesting. How do you how do you effectively give couples and families the chance to reproduce much later in life, which is kind of where society has been going. And there's a small window which is becoming smaller and smaller, just given some of the financial challenges in being able to procreate at an earlier age. And so, solving that, I think, would have a huge impact of, at least the reproductive rate of Americans, which I think is pretty important.
Very important. And so last few minutes left, the what you said about creating an egg cell out of a blood cell was fascinating, because essentially what that means is that we're coming on the age where we can actually find the keys to life in ways that, like, we can take cells and create different cells out of those cells. And I imagine that a lot of that has to do with stem cells and the potential inside of stem cells. But that's kind of wild that I for a few years ago, I got really interested in connective tissue and fascia and this tissue that's somewhat, it's not like really living, it's just structural tissue. And the visualization I got is that the transcriptome is shooting out proteins that kind of just create the structure that is so important, and that also sends a lot of signals. So there's like certain signals that go through fascia based on the way you stretch, and that fascia, according to a lot of the people, the body workers who study it, who became scientists in order to study it, because the doctors were mostly just kind of throwing it out the window, saying this stuff isn't important, it's just inert structural tissues. And so they found out a lot of different stuff, and it's just so wild that what you're saying is that we seem to be getting to the very secrets of how to influence life in ways to create totally different cells out of other cells. For the last few minutes, is there anything interesting you want to add on that subject?
Yeah, I mean, we invested in a company called Colossal that is trying to bring the woolly mammoth de-extinct. And the way that you do that is you have to be able to create an embryo, right, from another cell. And so it requires what we call gametogenesis, creating gametes from other cells. And the reason our hypothesis in investing in that company was just doing it with animals is just much faster. And if you could build an interesting business model around it, you're just going to get a lot more innovation than having to be able to do it in humans, which very reasonably have lots of guardrails around it. And you definitely want those guardrails, but trying to bring back a woolly mammoth is a very hairy and audacious goal. And so if you're able to accomplish it there, then you could transfer a lot of the technology at some point to humans, which we think is really interesting. And so all of it comes back to what's the right business model for deep tech, because if you're just going to go out and try to start a company that does this in humans, you're going to hit a funding wall, or you're going to hit long regulatory approval. You're going to hit a lot of issues, which there are companies that are trying it. Like there's a guy named Matt that started a company called Conception Bio, which is doing some incredible work. At the same time, like it's really tough. It's a really tough battle for them, right? To be able to get the funding runway in order to accomplish that.
Super interesting. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. And how can listeners find out more about you and what you're working on? Anything you want to share with the audience?
Yeah, reach out to anybody here at Jazz Venture Partners. We're very focused on investing in companies that are at the convergence of deep technology, deep science, and creative translation. And so if you have anything that you think would interest us, we're always our ears are always open.
Cool. Thank you so much.